I'd love to introduce Sarah. She's the author of Hick, the trailblazing journalist who captured Eleanor Roosevelt's heart. She writes historical fiction and nonfiction for adults and children alike, including The Borden Murders, which Louis Howe's wife, inherited the Borden estate. We always like that weird connection we have to the Lizzie Borden story. Everything's here at the Roosevelt Library. I mean, it connects to everything. So, which is hailed by the New York Times as a historical version of Law and Order, which, that's going to run for years. So that's gold. The Miracle and the Tragedy of the Dion Quintuplets, which received 4-starred reviews. Again, that's due for something, isn't it, on television. Her novels include Marmee and the USA Today bestselling Carolyn Little House Revisited. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Miller to you.
I'm going to play with this. Is this good? No. Okay, thank you. This is good to know. Let me get my... Come on. Okay. What do you think? Good? More? Okay. Okay. I'll get a little more. Better?
This is asking me to do something I'm not capable.
You're not qualified.
I'm not qualified at all. I can manage a library and I can't move a microphone.
I trust you. Okay, good morning. Thank you for coming. Enormous thank you to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library for inviting me, and especially for making the Lorena A. Hickok papers accessible for researchers since 1978. Because without that collection and their archivists, nobody could have written a book about Lorena Hickok worth its salt. If you notice that my voice and or the rest of me is shaking, you're probably correct. I'm very good at being nervous, and I'll also be fine very soon, don't worry. Lorena Hickok. Raise your hand if you've heard of Lorena Hickok. I love you. Started life as a nobody from nowhere. She grew up poor and abused, was evicted from her own family at the age of 14, and never managed to get a college diploma. And yet, by the time she was 40, she'd spent the night at the White House and would eventually reside there for months at a time. So how did that happen? And the answer is pretty simple. Lorena Hickok could write. And that's why today I want to discuss the part of her life that often gets overlooked in our eagerness to plumb the depths of her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's her newspaper career. Because without her success as a journalist, Lorena Hickok would never have entered the Roosevelt's orbit. And I'm going to pause for just a second here to do a little explaining about names. Lorena Hickok hated her first name. In her own words, it sounds like a patent medicine ad. She also hated what she called that Miss Biz. In fact, she hated it so much she would cross the Miss off of stationery that people gave her for Christmas. So I certainly won't be calling her Lorena or even Miss Hickok. We're going to call her by the name she adopted around the age of 25 and insisted on for the rest of her life, and that was Hick. Scholars tell us that Hick's first known piece of writing is an autobiographical anecdote in Lawrence University's literary magazine in 1913. But Hick herself reports her first composition as a few lines of doggerel about her 8th grade teacher, chalked onto a schoolroom slate long about 1907. His eyes are green, his hair is white, his nose is crooked, he's a fright. Her teacher was, shall we say, impressed with her descriptive powers. Professor Johnson made her apologize to the entire class, which was a punishment Hick found more agonizing than her father's beatings. But he also later chose Hick as class poet, remarking dryly that I seem to have an aptitude for verse making. The next year, he awarded her first place in an essay contest on Abraham Lincoln and chose her to represent the school in a county-wide declamatory contest, which was an ordeal she remembered as a nightmare, even though the Aberdeen newspapers called her performance a very delightful reading. Professor Johnson saw something in that 15-year-old that no one else, not even Hick herself, would recognize for several years. And maybe what he noticed is my favorite thing about Hick's writing, and that is her voice. It's something you really can't teach. It's just something you have. Most of us turn unrecognizably formal when we put pen to paper, but Hick sounds like Hick right from the get-go. And it doesn't matter if you've never met her. When you read one of her articles, letters, or later her field reports for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, it feels more like listening than reading. That first published piece of writing in the Laurentian magazine in 1913, a recollection of the comeuppance Hick received for trying to impress her grade school classmates back in Dakota with a pack of lies about her non-existent horseback riding skills, has a narrator you can't help but envision rolling her eyes and winking conspiratorially as the misadventure unfolds. My heart utterly refused to beat, Hick's story recounts, of the moment she saw a horse the schoolmate had tricked her into riding. Hick had told all the girls that she was a stunt rider, when in reality she didn't even know how to make an old gray mare go gidap. I gently tapped her on the flank using about half the force of a sick mosquito in the act, Hick wrote, but she simply wiggled her left ear and continued to gaze contemplatively at the scenery ahead. Then Kate offered to start her for me, and after I had somewhat meekly assented, vigorously applied a stick of lath. I have always been convinced there was a nail in that stick, for the fanciful maid bolted down the road as though chased by a whole army of demons. Every time her hoofs would touch the ground, I would bound fully 2 feet in the air, only to come down again with the force of 1,000 bricks. I like to think that's when Hick learned the value of a fundamental rule of journalism: stick to the facts. Hick seems to have gravitated toward journalism for 2 reasons. One, a rhetoric professor at Lawrence University, who also worked as a reporter and copy editor for the Milwaukee Sentinel, took notice of her classwork and suggested she consider a career in journalism instead of teaching. And number 2, newspaper work sounded better to Hick than the sweat and strain of her cousin's laundry business. It would be a long uphill battle, though, because in 1901, for instance, Ladies' Home Journal published an article asking, "Is the newspaper office the place for a girl?" Nearly every editor replied with some version of, "Good heavens, no." "I would rather see my daughter starve than that she should ever have heard or seen what the women on my staff had been compelled to hear and see," one proclaimed. Another declared, "In my 18 years of experience in this office, I have never yet seen a girl enter the newspaper field, but that I have noticed a steady decline in that innate sense of refinement, gentleness, and womanliness with which she entered it. They lose something. What? I cannot say in words." All of that was mostly baloney. What newspaper men really dreaded was the thought of giving up smoking, spitting, and swearing at their desks and swapping bawdy jokes over their coffee and cigars. "A woman? Never!" cried one editor at the prospect of hiring a female reporter. "Why, you can't say 'damn it' to a woman." Even the few women in the newspaper business cautioned their prospective colleagues against the job's demands. In order to make any progress in her work, she must break over the barriers raised against her, reporter Anne Elliott wrote in Collier's magazine in 1909. This means that she must be aggressive instead of gentle, pushing herself where she is not wanted. That she must be rude, if necessary, persistent, impertinent, callous, anything to gain her point. In short, she must forget that she is a woman. Hick never forgot that she was a woman, because those barriers would never let her, but she did make others forget. To fit in with her male colleagues, she took up smoking, drinking, swearing, and poker. And once she started writing news stories, the men had to take notice. Thanks to sexism, getting access to real news stories took a while. Her earliest assignments were the most mundane news in town, first in Battle Creek, Michigan, and then in Milwaukee. Women's page stuff, Hick called it. Hard news, which included everything from politics, finance, and sports to murders, fires, accidents, natural disasters, and scandal, remained very much a male's domain. Interviews turned out to be Hick's key to success. Fundamentally, there is no better outlet for the newspaper woman's skill, Ishbel Ross wrote in her 1936 History of Women Journalists, Ladies of the Press. It is the one job that the city editor does not necessarily think a man can do better. The most difficult assignment that can be given to a woman reporter, or to any reporter, in fact, is that of securing interviews with the socially prominent and exclusive, Anne Elliott agreed. And November of 1915 brought just such a figure to Milwaukee. Geraldine Farrar, diva of operatic stages from Monte Carlo to New York City. A few months before, she'd starred in a silent film, making her one of the first multimedia celebrities. 23-year-old Hick got the assignment, and I honestly don't know why. Only 4 of her earlier articles have been found, and they're good, but they're not that good. Nevertheless, Hick trooped half a mile through a dark and stormy night and waited inside the vestibule of Geraldine Farrar's private rail car for hours, before Miss Farrar's manager bothered to inform her that the diva would never give an interview on the night before a performance. Angry doesn't describe it at all, Hick said later. She stalked back to the newsroom, her best wolf suit a full size smaller, thanks to the rain, and pounded a scorcher into her typewriter. After splashing through exactly 163 puddles of water and plowing through an acre or so of nice, rich mud, most of which clung to my best shoes, she wrote, I arrived at the private car of the peerless Geraldine, only to learn first that she was indisposed, second, that she was too tired to see reporters tonight, and lastly, that she had become annoyed at the impudent questions which gentlemen and ladies of the press had been asking her, and therefore would submit to no newspaper interviews. I find consolation in the fact that all those nice interviews which will be published about Miss Farrar for the next few weeks will be fakes. Her manager told me so, and who on earth would know if not he? Denied even a glimpse of the prima donna to share with her readers, Hick detailed her interview with Miss Farrar's Boston Bulldog instead. He also kissed me. Oh, the thrill of it, to be kissed by Geraldine Farrar's dog. Her editor loved it. Say, that's great stuff, he said. Why didn't you tell us you could write funny yarns? What she'd meant as a spiteful stinger read to him as a crackerjack piece of comedy. Hick's story ran the next morning unchanged. That same afternoon, a telephone call came for Hick. She picked up the receiver to find Geraldine Farrar's manager on the line. Miss Farrar had been delighted by the story, he said, and so delighted that Miss Hickok was invited to visit the famous soprano that evening at the opera between acts. Everyone in the city room heard Hick's retort. You tell Miss Farrar for me to go to hell. World War I gave Hick her next big break. In the spring of 1917, the young men Hick regarded as her fiercest competition started enlisting in droves, and women began getting into all kinds of things, she recalled. We ran trolley cars, collected fares on trains, became policewomen, took men's jobs in the factories, and suddenly the newspaper offices were filled with us. There were women police reporters, women sports writers, even women city editors. Hick herself not only enrolled at the University of Minnesota that year, she also got a position with the Minneapolis Tribune. Owing to her school schedule, Hick's specialty at the Tribune became the night rewrite. So when the phone rang in the wee hours, she was there to answer it, take down the facts from the reporter on the other end of the line, and then she transformed those bits of information into smoothly flowing sentences and paragraphs in time to make the morning edition. It wasn't byline material because she hadn't gathered the news herself, but it was honest-to-goodness news. A good deal of it was front-page news. Even with reduced competition, infuriating setbacks still remained. When a devastating fire broke out near Duluth in October of 1918, the Tribune sent a man to cover the story, because of course they did. No newspaper editor in 1918 was going to send a college co-ed into that inferno. Hick sat back at the office, stewing in thoughts of black murder. But when the phone rang and the man in Duluth started shouting facts into her ear, Hick turned the stream of information into a series of brilliant rewrites that made the front page under banner headlines for the next 3 days. Hundreds of people are reported missing. Cities and towns have been wiped out. Scores after scores of farms have been fire swept, and the fate of the people in a large area of northeastern Minnesota is unknown as a result of restless gale-fanned forest fires which carried everything before them last night. That's when it became clear that any time the occasion called for it, Hick could set her colorful voice aside and write straight news copy that was indistinguishable from the men's work. After that, Hick's skills quickly expanded in every direction she could reach. By 1919, she'd been promoted to Sunday editor of the Tribune. She also became known as the cleverest interviewer in this section of the country. Her roster included mayors, murderers, athletes, musicians, authors, politicians, hypnotists, explorers, dancers, and human carnival exhibits. But Hick interviewed more than just the famous and the infamous. One Christmas, she undertook a series on the plights of the 6 poorest families in Minneapolis. Her Christmas Eve finale featured a widower with 5 children who had recently given up his farm and placed his youngest daughter with an adoptive family. The baby, I hated to see her go, the man confided. She was a fine baby, never was sick, never cried, but I didn't think she ought to have to suffer when she could go to a good home. Hick hadn't just honed the skill of when to let people speak for themselves, but also how to distill their circumstances and feelings down to their essence. Usually she did it in the final line or two, hitting her readers with an emotional wallop. And in the meantime, she concluded the widower's story, one 8-year-old girl, one pair of twins, boy and girl, and one 4-year-old boy are wondering what Santa Claus is going to bring them tomorrow. Is there a Santa Claus? And there was. The series so moved an inmate serving a life sentence at Stillwater Correctional Facility that he offered $20, the equivalent of almost $400 today, to one of the featured families. Now, in the midst of all this serious business, Hick was also turning out Girl Cub Reporter features, in which she chronicled herself dashing about town in search of inane bits of news, or starring in minor capers, like working a lunch hour shift as a Santa Claus in a local department store. May I be boiled in oil, inch by inch, and never get another Christmas present as long as I live if I ever deny Santa Claus again, she proclaimed after trying to persuade the skeptical youngsters who crowded onto her lap that she was indeed Kris Kringle. These stories were sly spoofs on the stunt girl reporting Nellie Bly had pioneered in the 1880s, back when the stunts were well and truly spectacular, like feigning mental illness in order to infiltrate and expose the inhumane conditions at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, or circumnavigating the globe in a record-breaking 72 days. In Nellie Bly's day, the fact that a woman was reporting the story was itself an integral part of the article. The very thought of a lady undertaking such dangerous tasks blew readers' minds. They didn't just want to know what Nellie Bly uncovered, they wanted to know what happened to Nellie Bly as she uncovered it. The risks to her perceived femininity and innocence were an essential part of the formula. And so in her stories, Nellie Bly was not so much a reporter witnessing the news as she was the main character of a drama in which she experienced the news. So Hick takes hold of this trope and turns it on its head, mocking the fact that women were still too often deemed lesser reporters worthy only of lesser assignments. Everyone in town knew she was no simpering airhead, and yet Hick wrote her Girl Cub Reporter stories as though some of her brains had trickled out of her ear. When she covered traditionally masculine endeavors like ice fishing or golf, for instance, she put on a staggering show of ignorance that highlighted the absurdities of the sport. Mostly she poked fun at the frivolous news that was so often relegated to women staffers. One of the best of them has her dutifully trekking about town to see if a woman could get away with smoking in the cabarets and restaurants of Minneapolis, because they'd gotten word that women could do this in New York and Chicago. To her dismay, none of the waiters or managers blinked an eye at the smoke rising from her ivory purple cigarette holder. Half a dozen restaurants later, the girl reporter lamented to her friends, "Give me a cigar, oh, give me something quick, be tough, I've got to get thrown out somewhere." No one did, but that didn't stop her from turning the whole escapade into just the kind of swell, funny yarn her editor had ordered. Hick's Girl Cub Reporter features weren't news, they were comedy, and Minneapolis gobbled them up. When a Girl Cub Reporter story was in the paper, the Tribune put a notice on the front page to ensure readers wouldn't miss it. The Tribune even commissioned illustrations for several of them, ratcheting up their humor with drawings of Hick that mimicked the comic strips. The news on August 2nd, 1923, shook the nation. President Warren G. Harding had died in California in the middle of a transcontinental trip dubbed the Voyage of Understanding. So the train that had carried him to Alaska and down the west coast of North America suddenly became his funeral cortege. Mourners from coast to coast were cramming the railroad tracks so closely the locomotive could hardly move forward. Hick smelled a human interest story. And instead of heading to a city like Omaha to witness the phenomenon, she aimed for Honey Creek, Iowa, population 76. The funeral train was scheduled to pass the town at 3 o'clock in the morning, but by 1:15, plenty of the folks were heading for the station because no one wanted to risk missing it. For 2.5 hours, Hick stood with the entire population of that little town as they waited. The locomotive's headlamp finally came into view at 3:45 a.m., and a few seconds later, the great moment had passed. Hick had her story, but she couldn't find a typewriter, not even in Omaha. So she went to a telegraph office, and instead of writing the story, she spoke it, composing it aloud to the operator as he transmitted it over the wires back to Minneapolis. "I have written 9 books, and I cannot imagine rattling off even a rough draft like that, much less ready to print copy." This next little bit may cause me to have emotions. You've been warned. Almost nothing happened in that story. A train passed by a small town in the dead of night, just as dozens of trains did every night. And somehow Hick conveyed the feel of that crowd in a way that raises goosebumps. Reading that article is just like standing elbow to elbow with the women who had jangled their dinner bells to waken the neighborhood in the dead of night. This is sooner than it should have happened. The little boys craning on fences and stepladders, and the veterans of the Great War holding their babies up high as the train went by. Hick, you're killing me. The long moaning whistle around the bend, the blinding shaft of light, down the glittering rails, good God. The roar and wind and trembling of the earth, the breathless wait for the rear car, the flashing vision of wreaths and flags and rigid figures in khaki, the red taillights vanishing like pinpoints in the dark. I've never done this out loud, and it shows. Yes, it was worth waiting for. The next year, the full article appeared in a book entitled The Best News Stories of 1923. By the mid-1920s, Hick could call herself a star reporter at the Minneapolis Tribune, and the city's zoo had even named a lion cub Miss Hick in her honor. And one assignment stood above all of that: the University of Minnesota football. In a state that had no professional teams to root for, college football was serious business. Fans of the gridiron depended on the Gophers to satisfy their football fix. So obviously the Tribune's editor sent his star reporter to cover the games. But he didn't put Hick in the press box with the fellows from the sports department. Heavens no. She had to content herself with a seat in the stands with all the other fans. But if the exclusion wounded her ego, it sure didn't hurt her writing. Sitting in the thick of things put Hick that much closer to the heart of the game, which turned out to be the best place for a reporter of her particular strengths. Hick left the play-by-play to the official sports writers, the dudes, and her skill was recreating the atmosphere of the stadium, the whole experience of attending a sporting event. And when Hick combined technical knowledge of the game with her superb eye for detail and mood, wow. Hick made the folks at home feel as though they were right there in the stands. Players didn't just run or dash in her stories. She transformed the Gophers into forces of nature, intimately familiar to the Minneapolis fans. And then the Minnesota Prairie Fire was off, she wrote. Right down the field they went, plowing, plunging, prancing through. Hick could even make something as intangible as a lucky break into something alive, something fans could cheer or boo. And then an old hussy named Lady Luck got into the game, she groused in the Tribune after a particularly crushing defeat. For 3 seasons, my speech isn't moving. For 3 seasons, Hick's football coverage regularly made the front page, sometimes with a full-page banner headline. As it had done with her Girl Cub reporter stories, the Tribune proudly advertised her coverage of upcoming games. To top the climax, Lorena Hickok will do a feature on the Iowa-Minnesota game as only Hick can do it, the Tribune bragged in the run-up to the 1925 Big Ten championship tournament. Miss Hickok's rollicking sketch of the contest and crowds was part of the supreme thrill of the football season. To the team, Hick became an unofficial mascot, their anti-gopher, and she adopted the players as her dear nephews, christening herself the Gophers Poet Laureate. After the Gophers lost the 1925 championship game to the University of Michigan's Wolverines on the Ann Arbor field, Hick consoled fans back home with a report that I can hardly talk about, much less read, without having even more emotions. And we've had plenty of that. Her sportsmanship destroys me, and I don't even like football. But you can find it at the end of chapter 22 of Hick. But maybe that's why the fans loved Hick's coverage so much. She put her love of the game and the players on display, letting them live it through her. Hick herself cherished her achievement in sports reporting as if it were a trophy. In the decades to come, she rarely failed to mention her football coverage as an example of both the breadth of her skill and as a symbol of how far she'd managed to advance in the traditionally male field of journalism. By 1928, Hick had leapt from the Minneapolis Tribune all the way to the Associated Press headquarters in New York City, where she quickly proved that she could tackle anything, and she wrote with color, finish, a keen news sense, and good judgment. Now, I'm going to cheat a little here, because I can't stand the thought of leaving this next part out, even though it happened after the event I picked for the finale. So instead of trying to fool you, I'm just going to ask you to indulge me. On November 13, 1928, the steamship Vestris sunk 200 miles off the coast of Virginia, spilling 328 passengers and crew into the Atlantic Ocean. Hick met the rescue liner at the Battery docks and got an interview with one of 60 passengers who survived the wreck, a man who'd clung to a disintegrating piece of wreckage for 24 hours. The next day, Hick's Vestris article appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Its byline read, "By Paul A. Dana, as told to Lorena A. Hickok, Associated Press staff reporter." That day, Hick became the first woman ever to see her byline on the New York Times front page. Hick's article wasn't the first Vestris survivor's tale to hit the papers, but it was far and away the best. Where other reporters' stories were so clinically formal that they sound like treatises on boat safety, Hick used plain words and concise sentences that put you right in the water alongside Paul Dana. Towards sunset, it began to cloud up, and then a thought flashed into my mind that made me feel a little sick all over. Sharks. Now, a casual reader might think Hick had just typed out every word Dana said, but journalists knew better. The Raleigh News and Observer immediately praised Hick's Vestris story as a masterpiece of reporting. And here's the twist. Her invisibility in that article is exactly what proves her skill. Hick doesn't allow a speck of clutter into the narrative. She relays Paul Dana's experience so cleanly and directly that a photograph couldn't have captured the scene better. As the News and Observer said, she painted a picture that will stand when the lurid writing of this calamity of the sea, with all of its picturesque detail and harrowing adjectives, is forgotten. Now let's rewind back to her brand new job at the Associated Press. That very first week, Hick found herself assigned to cover the coveted arena of politics, and believe it or not, sexism got her the beat. New York Governor Al Smith, the Democratic Party's first Catholic nominee for president, was ramping up his campaign for the White House that summer. And although the AP's staff is supposed to be objective and unbiased, its Southern Protestant reporters kept infuriating the Democratic leaders with anti-Catholic sentiments in their articles. "Well, why not send that girl over there," the AP's general manager said one day, indicating Hick. They'd at least have to be polite to her instead of bouncing her out of the 23rd floor on her head if another anti-Catholic reporter embarrassed the company. And Hick wasn't about to refuse. But it turned out that aside from the occasional press conference, there really wasn't that much news happening at Democratic headquarters. The real political reporting belonged to the more experienced AP men who traveled with Smith as he campaigned. Sometimes, on particularly dull days, Hick remembered, I would wander down to the women's division looking for a feature story. And that is where Lorena Hickok first encountered Eleanor Roosevelt. And I would love to tell you more about how she covered the Lindbergh kidnapping or the Roosevelt campaign and everything that follows with Mrs. Roosevelt, but they only let us have this room for an hour, so you're gonna have to buy the book, friends. Are there any questions? Nobody.
We're Michigan alumni, so.
Yes. I'm from Michigan. Yes. A bit north of Detroit, south of Flint.
Yeah.
You know.
We're Detroit.
Yeah.
And,
Very good. Yes, sir.
I have a question, but that was one.
Thank you.
I knew nothing about her career prior to so what a remarkable.
Yeah, she really was. I mean, you could write a book about Hick if she had never met Mrs. Roosevelt, because her achievements in journalism at that time were so big. She was, I mean, the fact that she's covering the Lindbergh story in 32, that is the story of the year, if not the century, up to that moment. And she was the one.
Very nice.
Yes, ma'am.
Welsh Cook said that Eleanor was a serial romantic.
Okay.
She focused all of her affection on one person and died in the next one.
Yeah.
And many people have said that her relationship at the end was mainly based on duty and there was no affection between the two. And you've taken issue with that, said it's mainly quantitative based on letters, but
Yeah.
they were living together. So
Yeah.
that's not
Sure. The paper trail between, the correspondence between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok begins in, there's like one, maybe 2 or 3 letters in 1932, and it spans all the way to Mrs. Roosevelt's death in 62. And it does taper off over the years. My point of view is at the beginning when we get those big, long, just a wee bit steamy letters, the relationship is new. Eleanor Roosevelt has a brand new job in the White House that she doesn't want. Hick has given up her career in journalism because of her connection with the Roosevelts, and she has a brand new job that takes her away from Eleanor Roosevelt for weeks or months at a time. And that's when you get 12, 14-page letters. As the decades go on, that does taper off. But there are also factors like Hick's time when she's living at the White House. When you're 3 doors down the hall, you're not sending letters. In the 50s, when Hick was living in Hyde Park, there are this many letters. But she was living in Hyde Park. She even lived with Eleanor Roosevelt for a year at Valkill. And when she did move out, she was 3 miles away. And there's telephones now. Telephones aren't quite the indulgence they used to be. The calls aren't as costly. And I suspect they were in touch more than we have evidence of. Because even in the 30s, Eleanor Roosevelt just loved being able to indulge in that phone call and hear Hick's voice. She says that again and again in those letters. So the intensity does appear to cool. I liken it to, they start with a bonfire and they end with a hearth fire. It's always warm. It's either intense or it's cozy, but it's always warm, and they're always friends. Anybody? Yes? It was syndicated, so it was everywhere. Hick would advise a bit on Eleanor's My Day columns. She would offer, if she read an early draft, she would offer suggestions and almost always praise. But she doesn't seem to have been instrumental in that process. But it's still very interesting to me because after 20 years in journalism, Hick gave up her career for Eleanor, essentially. And then here goes Mrs. Roosevelt writing in the newspaper for decades. And Hick I never saw a speck of jealousy or envy on Hick's end. She collected the ones that she thought were especially good. And when she read one and, she would write a letter and saying, this one was great. It seems really big of her to me. Yes?
Is it true that Hick died of pauper and no one claimed her body because she was taken to the cemetery?
Yep. Yeah, Hick, I think at the end, she was not really, really hurting for money in the sense that she could eat and pay her bills. But when she died, in her will, she specified she wanted to be immediately cremated. She wanted no religious service whatsoever, unless Reverend Kidd, who had conducted the Roosevelts' funeral services, if he would come to the crematory and read a prayer, she could tolerate that, but only him. So that was done, and she said that what was done with her ashes was immaterial, and they apparently took her at her word, and they put her on a shelf in Hyde Park for 20 years. There were some local women who got wind of that. One of them, I think, was the president of the Historical Society in Hyde Park, and she and a number of women banded together, including Blanche Wiesen Cook, who's Eleanor Roosevelt's preeminent biographer. They did fundraising, and they marked the grave with a plaque, a bluestone bench, and a dogwood tree, because Hick had said in her will that, well, it's immaterial, but if you can put me under a tree that might benefit from the chemicals in the ashes, that would be all right. And there wasn't a tree in that section of the Rhinebeck Cemetery, so they brought the tree to her, as one of them said.
Why do you think Eleanor didn't make arrangements for her to take over care of?
At the end, at the end of her life? I think she did help. I don't think Hick was quite as impoverished as maybe there's a perception of. Mrs. Roosevelt had arranged for her to have the apartment that she occupied It was a lower floor in what used to be a rectory. I don't remember what church off the top of my head, right here in town. Because Hick's mobility was waning, so she needed the first floor. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt always had a safety net ready to unfurl under Hick at all times. But Hick had pride. And there were times when she was like, no. And so there was some push and pull there. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt died 6 years before Hick. So, at the end, Hick is really on her own. But, yeah, I think they kind of did as best they could given their two personalities. Eleanor Roosevelt was so generous. And there were times when that was hard for Hick to fully accept because she couldn't return it in kind. And the imbalance bothered Hick, but it doesn't seem to have bothered Eleanor Roosevelt. I saw a hand.
Eleanor in her will gave Hick $1,000, and at the end of
You're right.
her life, I think it was still $750 left, and she did not want to spend it. She did put it in her will to take her Eleanor's grandmother.
Yes, she and Hick and Sisty had a relationship, just a friendly relationship afterwards. That was Anna Roosevelt and her daughter were the two Roosevelts that Hick really did maintain ties with after Eleanor's death. The rest of them she kind of didn't have any use for, but yeah. Yes?
Comment and then welcome you to making an observation, but it seems to me as much as the public knows about her, it's been characterized and acknowledged by a certain level of prurience, right? And it's so nice and refreshing that you're spreading knowledge that takes us away from that, that aspect and broadens and deepens our understanding.
Right. I mean, it's important to acknowledge their relationship because it was real and true and deep and lasted for 30 years. But Hick is more than that. Eleanor Roosevelt was everything to her, but Hick, in her own right, deserves recognition.
But in addition, I would say it wasn't just did they, a relationship, it was more like did they or didn't they?
Right, exactly. Yeah. What did they do behind closed doors exactly? Like, you don't ask married people that. You just, people do what they need to do. And if they're getting what they need, and if Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok were getting what they needed from each other, that's all that matters.
So thank you for taking us away from that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, sir.
Did she, what kind of influence did Hick have on Eleanor's politics? Did she have anything other than you feel that she wanted to pass and ask Eleanor if she could ask?
Not to my knowledge. She was so adamant about not using her connections any more than every now and then she felt absolutely necessary. There are moments where you can directly see her influence, such as Eleanor Roosevelt's famous press conferences with women journalists. That was something she and Hick had concocted together because she had learned from Hick how tough it was for a woman to get in that position. And once the Depression hit, women are the first cuts. And so they figured, okay, if the only way to get access to the First Lady's press conferences, which are unprecedented in and of themselves, is to either retain or hire female journalists, that protects jobs for women. And also Hick's, maybe many of you are familiar with the Arthurdale community that Eleanor was so involved with. She had been aware that the conditions for minors were quite poor in that area, but it was Hick's reports when she was working for FARA. Hick really sounded the alarm, and her distress at what she had seen is what actually brings Eleanor Roosevelt to those people in person. And as soon as she sees that the conditions are indeed as Hick has described, she leaps into action. It's like the spring of that year she visits, and by the fall, those little houses are going up for the miners. So that was another direct line. Good.
So, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. That was super fun.
So good. Thank you.